just breathe into your back here. Open up the low back. And at the same time, activate your shoulder girdle by pushing down through your hands, lifting the chest and the head away from the floor, rotating the upper arms, the humeri out, drawing the shoulder blades slightly down away from the head, and stretching the crown of the head away from the shoulder blades. And just watch that in pulling the shoulder blades down, that with that action in particular, it's not causing your ribs to push forward and your back to arch, your low back. Good. And you can come up off your hands into a kneeling position. So if you need some more cushion, you can put a blanket or something under your knees. And bring the arms in front. Shift your weight onto your left knee. So push down with that left hip and unweight the right knee. Then step the right foot forward. Check that the left knee is a little bit wider than your left hip. Likewise, the right knee. And then raise the left arm slowly, carefully up, and lower the right. And watch that you're not lifting your rib cage up with your arm. But keep the ribs connected to the pelvis. And then anchor the shoulder blade down onto the ribs from the back and from the side. And arms forward. You're going to shift the weight onto that left leg, left hip. Step the right foot back. Then push down. Load the right hip, unweight the left. Step the left foot forward. Check the position of your knees. And then raise the right arm carefully. Lower the left. So more than the height of the arm, emphasize lifting the arm without lifting the ribs. Better still, try to drop the ribs as you raise the arm. And then as you pull the shoulder blade down, stretch the hand a little further. So try to create some opposition there where your hand, your forearm are trying to pull away from your shoulder, and your shoulder blade is pulling away from the hand and the forearm. So your shoulder should be very, very active here. And arms forward. You're going to unweight the left leg. Step that back. And once more, bring the right foot forward. Adjust the knees. And raise the left arm. Same thing. And this time add a little bit of a turn towards your right knee from the left side of the pelvis. Just a little. Don't turn so far that your left foot gets pulled away from the center of the mat. In fact, you can plant that left foot as you turn. It's not a big turn. And then anchor down through your left knee as you stretch the arm. Again, keeping the ribs connected to the pelvis, and so your ribs move toward your left knee and your left arm is reaching away from the knee. Crown of the head away from the knee. And turn back to the front. Step the right foot back. Step the left foot forward. And raise the right arm. So now you're turning the pelvis a little to the left here. Make sure that you don't turn it so strongly that your right foot slides out to the side of the mat. Try to keep that right foot planted in the center of the mat. And push down, anchor down through your right knee as you stretch the arm. Anchor down with the shoulder blade as you stretch the arm. Again, crown of the head stretches away from the right knee. And then back to the front. You can step the left foot back. Then you're bringing your palms down, and you want to try to do that without falling and catching yourself. So it's oddly difficult. There's a tendency, we tend to just kind of cruise past the last couple inches here. See if you can avoid that. So you really have to use your abs and your hips more to bring the palm to the floor. Then you can go back to quadruped, and then even a little further out into a kneeling plank. And then same emphasis as in quadruped before. You're opening up the low back, so you make sure that your low back isn't sinking forward, sinking down. And even more so here, stabilizing your shoulder girdle, activating the shoulder girdle. So pushing down, lifting the chest higher, the head higher, rotating the upper arms out, drawing the shoulder blades down, reaching the crown of the head away from the shoulder blades, making sure here especially that any downward pull of the shoulder blades doesn't cause your spine to hyperextend. Then try and hold the rotation, bend your elbows, lower yourself down as slowly as you can. Then bring your hands above your head, elbows out, fingers pointing in, bring your forehead down, roll your knees out a little. And breathe into your low back and open up the low back. Then keeping your lumbar spine stable, Draw the shoulder blades down, reach through the crown of the head, and lift the head a little bit up. Meanwhile, keep activating your lower abdominals to support the low back, but releasing tension from the glutes and the hamstrings as much as you can. If you can, in fact, release the glute tension, let's say you find you're tightening the glutes and then you let that go, then try to see how that requires that you recruit the abdominal muscles even more to do for you what the glutes were doing for you when they were tightening. All right, then go ahead and bring the head down, rest a moment. Now you can leave the head down. You're going to bend your knee. So we're not taking the knee to the side here. We're just bending, flexing the knee so the heel is coming up toward the buttock. And you want to make sure that as the heel comes in, the pubic bone doesn't lift away from the floor. If the pubic bone comes off the floor, then you basically exceeded the range of your knee flexion, and now you're starting to flex your hip instead. So you want to make sure the pubic bone stays down. And you also want to keep stabilizing your low back so that you don't get any unnecessary pressure in your low back. And therefore you're just targeting the left quadriceps here. And you can bring that one down, switch to the right. Here again, try not to recruit the glutes to help you. You're going to use your hamstrings to be able to bend the knee this way, but try not to tighten the buttock. And release the right, go back to the left. Now you can add the lift of the head here. Just a little lift is fine. And then try freeing up your left arm. So your left arm reaches back. And if you find that when you remove the support of your left arm, you feel a lot of pressure in your low back or you get pain in your low back, just carefully bring that arm forward again. But if you're able to keep your low back stable and reach back with your left hand, then if the foot is available, you can catch hold of the foot. Again, don't pull it in so much that your pubic bone comes up, because that will load the back in an inappropriate way. So keep the pubic bone down here, but try not to use glute strength to do that if you can avoid it. And if you simply can't reach the foot, then don't worry about it. You can just have the hand back there if that's doable for you, or you can just bring the hand back up where it was alongside the head. So any of those is fine. And you can release that, bring the arm forward again, bring the left leg down, bring your head down. and rest a moment. So this pose always, all the variations that we're going to do are going to start with open up and stabilize your low back. So try to remember that that's the first step for each of these postures. So you're going to do that first, then bend the right knee, then lift the head, then unweight the right arm, reach the right arm back, then decide whether your low back is still safe in that position, and if you decide it isn't, bring the arm forward again. And if you decide that it is, then see if your foot's available. And if it isn't, then just don't worry about that, just stretch the arm. If the foot is available and you can add some load to the quad, feel free to do that. Just make sure it's only going into your quad and not into your back. It should also not cause pain in your knee. So if you're feeling it in the knee, then you're pulling too much, or you need to stop pulling with your hand altogether. Keep coming back to stabilizing the low back, to that very first thing you did to set up the posture. Then release that. If you're holding the foot, let that go. Bring the arm forward. Bring the right foot down. Bring the head down and rest. Breathe into the back. Anchor the shoulder blades. Lift the head. Reach through the crown of the head as you continue to pull the shoulder blades down. Then stretch the left arm back. If your low back is stable enough without that support, then keep the left arm back. If it isn't, bring the left arm forward again. If it is stable enough, then try bringing the right arm also back. So your hands are a little bit off the floor. You're reaching your hands away from your head, stretching the crown of the head and the shoulder blades, or stretching the crown of the head away from the hands. So your hands follow, your shoulder blades follow your hands. The spine is lengthening in opposition to that. Keep stabilizing the low back. So you should feel your abdominal muscles pushing down, lifting the lumbar spine up. Try not to recruit the glutes. Then bring the right hand forward, bring the left hand forward, bring your head down and rest. So we're doing these postures in stages, so that if you reach a stage where you feel that you're starting to exceed what you're able to do, you can just go back to the previous stage. So remember, it all starts with the very basic posture of 3 months prone, stabilizing the low back, lifting and uprighting the head and the upper part of the spine, using the shoulder blades in opposition to the head to help get more extension in the upper part of the spine. Then stretching one hand back, then the other hand back, stretching the hands and the head in opposite directions. So the next stage would be to bend the knees, bend both the knees. And then you would add an action here, which is you're reaching your knees away from your hips, which is going to bring your knees a little bit away from the floor. So you have to be extra careful here because it's going to push into the low back. And so you need to make sure that you have enough strength to stabilize the low back as you add that load. And then if you don't feel like you can do that, you keep your knees straight. And you would straighten the legs first, then bring one hand forward, then the other hand forward, then the head down. Breathe into the back. Anchor the shoulder blades, lift the head. Stretch the arms back. Bend the knees. If the feet are available, you catch the feet. Now you have to be really careful with this part because once you catch hold of the feet, you may be already loading the back more than you're comfortable with. So if you recognize that, then don't hold the feet. But if you can get hold of the feet and still keep your low back safe, then you've got your bowstring in place. So this is dhanurasana. And then you can gradually put tension on the bowstring to increase the back bend. And what you're wanting to find out here is, can I increase that back bend without exceeding my ability to stabilize the back? So once you have that bowstring in place, now your legs and arms are working a lot more, putting a lot more load that you have to stabilize against. So the demand for stabilization increases dramatically with this posture. And you lower yourself down, release the legs, straighten the legs. One at a time, bring the arms forward and the head down. So remember the variations that led up to this posture. Right, we're doing dhanurasana, and you might be doing a different version than the one that I'm demonstrating and that maybe other people are doing. So it's up to you to figure out what's the version that is most appropriate for me. For those of you who want another go at it, then go ahead and try it one more time. Just keep breathing into the back. And release. This time bring the hands alongside the chest. Press up out of it. So you're back to a kneeling plank. And you want to make sure that you're in a plank and you're not in a, say, more of an upward facing dog position here. And the main tell is you should feel your low back opening up and not feeling compressed. So open up the back and then gradually start moving your hips back. Little by little. And if you feel at any point as you're basically squatting back with your hips that your back is resisting you, then just stop there. Take a few breaths. Breathe not only into the lower back, but into the lower abdomen. Activate the lower abdominals, activate the pelvic floor if you can. That should unload the spine, and that should take away the resistance in the low back and allow you to squat back further. If it doesn't, then don't go any further back. In other words, make sure that your body, your hips, your back are giving permission to increase the bend in the hips, and you're not trying to force anything. And bring your hands in towards your knees and come up off your hands again. Okay, arms forward. Unweight the right leg. Step the right foot forward. Make sure that left knee is a little bit out. So we're going to add to, we're going to do something different with this than we did previously, which is this sequence of sitting back, keeping a neutral spine. So I'm sitting, sort of squatting back, right, which is going to load this hip, this knee, so make sure you don't overload it. And then however low I go, I'm going to keep the pelvis and the trunk at that height as I come forward into my right hip. This should register as a load or a pressure in the right hip, right groin, and not as a load or pressure in your low back. Then uprighting. So uprighting around the left hip. A lot of space in the back, a lot of length. Then sitting back and shifting forward. And once more, uprighting, sitting back, and shifting forward. And then just hang out here in the tripod for a few breaths. Again, make sure that the load is in your hip and not in your back. Then you can switch your legs around from here. And then come upright. Sitting back. Again, neutral spine, so don't go so low that you end up tucking. And then try to stay at that height as you come forward. So you're basically transferring the load from the right quadriceps into the left groin. Make sure that the head and the chest don't drop down. And uprighting. Sitting back. And shifting forward. Uprighting. Sitting back. And shifting forward. And just hold that for a few breaths. Make sure that what you feel is a load in the left hip, left groin, and not in your lower back. keep uprighting the head, upper part of the spine. And you can step the left foot back, so you're back in quadruped. And then just reset the quadruped. Again, with an emphasis on opening up that lumbar area, breathing into that. So make sure that the pelvis is aligned with the rib cage in a way that lets you do that. If your pelvis is tipped too far forward, then you're going to feel the low back collapsing in. You're not going to feel that space in the low back. So make sure that it's not, your pelvis is, if need be, tipped a little further back. Then bring the toes under and prepare to take some more weight in your arms and lift the hips. So you're in bear. And really reach with the arms, really push. So you want to add to that, you want to respond rather to that added weight by actively stretching, working your shoulder girdle to support that. Then walking in and squatting, doesn't have to be very deep. But the hips and knees should be back, so you don't want to be way forward in your knees here. And you want the pelvis upright enough that the back still feels open and not compressed. Chin in, neck long. Eyes are more down, much more down than they are forward. And then come all the way up to standing. And bring your feet back to pelvis width. Good. Let's do a calf stretch. Left foot. Roll your thigh bones out. And remember why you want the thigh bones, why you want to rotate them out. Try to understand the purpose of that. For a lot of people, I'd say at least 8 out of 10 people that I work with, they have a lot of internal rotation. They tend toward a lot of internal rotation in their hips. So if they're just standing, if we're just standing, most of us will stand with the thigh bones rolled in relative to what would be considered a neutral alignment of the thigh bone. So we're externally rotating, not for the sake of external rotation, but to try to get out of that internal rotation. So why does that matter? Well, if I'm internally rotated, the pelvis will tend to anteriorly rotate, which means the pelvis tends to tip forward. And you can experiment with that and see that that's true. If you, instead of trying to roll your thigh bones out, if you deliberately roll your thigh bones in, you're going to immediately feel the pelvis tip forward. And when you feel that, you're going to feel the low back hyperextend, the lumbar spine hyperextend. And what you're going to feel with hyperextension is a lot of tension, a lot of sort of grip and ropiness in those lumbar extensors. Conversely, if you externally rotate and get your hips closer to neutral, if possible, completely out of that internal rotation, the pelvis will tend to roll the opposite way. The buttock will tend to drop down, the low back will lengthen, and that hypertension in the spinal muscles will start to go away. What a lot of us do is, instead of uprighting the pelvis to get rid of, to resolve the hypertension, we tend to just push our hips forward. So you want to make sure that you're actually getting the pelvis to upright and you're not just pushing your hips out in front of you. Right? Those are two very different things. All right, you can switch to the right foot. So a while back I was talking about this feeling in the lower back, in the lower abdomen, down into the pelvis, which is a feeling of a sober feeling. A feeling that you're more grounded, you're more calm. So that outward rotation leading to more uprighting of the pelvis, which is a posterior tilt where the back of the pelvis drops down, the front of the pelvis rotates a little bit toward the lower front ribs. Meanwhile, the ribs are settling down toward the front of the pelvis. So you're getting a little more activation of the abdominals. You want to let that activation just happen as the pelvis uprights and the ribs drop, rather than trying to muscle it by making that happen. Those are also two very different things. So you're letting the pelvis upright, you're allowing the lumbar spinal tension to decrease, you're letting your intra-abdominal pressure move into the low back more, so that now the breath, supported by the abdominal muscles in the front, is helping to maintain a more open, more relaxed, more sober feeling in the lower part of the spine. All of that should be possible without any activation of your buttocks. All right, so you can release that. Now in the top of the foot stretch, this is even more crucial. As I take my left foot back with the toes under, I'm trying to get onto the top of the foot, that's part of it, but I'm also moving my left hip toward extension, and whenever I do that, it's going to have a tendency to pull my pelvis into an anterior tilt. So at the same time that I'm stretching my foot and maybe mildly extending my hip, I'm also externally rotating my thigh bones and trying to encourage that uprighting of the pelvis again, so that the pelvis stays connected to the rib cage and doesn't get pulled with the leg. Here again, the tendency is to push the hips forward to try to accomplish something similar, but all that does is basically just shut everything off on the posterior side. So we're not trying to just switch everything off. What we're trying to do is have tone, but not hypertone in the spinal muscles. So we still want support of those posterior muscles. We just don't want them to be the only thing holding the spine up. All right, then you can switch sides. And the two sides are often different, so you really are having to be aware of, as you take your foot into position, in this case your right foot, is that pulling on your pelvis? Is that causing your pelvis to tip forward? Is that causing your low back to arch and tighten up? And can you not let that happen? Either by not taking the foot as far back, having the foot a little bit more forward, or by using, again, external rotation, uprighting, abdominal muscles, intra-abdominal pressure, or a combination of those things. In this posture, we often avoid doing the things we ought to be doing because all of those adjustments will tend to put more load in your foot. So if your foot's sensitive, then you're going to tend to divert that load into your low back or your hips more. So that's why more cushioning is a good idea. So you can release that. And then one more example here, heel raise. So when you do a heel raise, you're pushing the 4 feet down, you're lifting your heels up. And when we do this, a lot of times we'll kind of arch and sort of tighten the low back to try to, to stabilize, because we feel unstable and we're trying to get our heels off the floor, which tends to kind of throw everything forward. So you want to try to keep that open, sober feeling in the low back as you raise the heels and as you lower the heels. And just repeat that a few times. So you're really just working your feet here and lower leg and not really anything else. All right, now Trikonasana, arms forward, feet apart, slight bend to the knees. So it's sort of a squat, but wide and high, not trying to go low here, just a little bend. And that little bend makes it easier for me to keep the thigh bones rotated, which makes it easier for me to upright my pelvis, which makes it easier for me to stabilize my trunk, which is the point of that setup. Then align your feet to your right. Align your heels, stretch your arms, and even, so you're still a little bit bent in the knees, you're still externally rotated. So even when you go to straighten your legs here, which you should do, you want to try to straighten the legs without changing what's going on between the pelvis and the rib cage. And likewise, as you bend down to the right side, you're keeping the trunk stable, keeping the low back stable, keeping the pelvis upright to the rib cage. And if you can do that, then this posture will be an effective counterpose to the back bends that we did earlier. And if you can't do that, it won't be an effective back bend. So if you find that you're doing the best you can here, and regardless of that you feel pain or pressure in your back, then just carefully come out. Don't keep holding the position. Which doesn't mean that you can't do the posture, but what I would suggest then is you do a short hold and you repeat sides more often. So we can come up from there. So we'll do a little version of that. So switch sides. So here I like to bend my knees slightly again, outwardly rotate, upright, stabilize, stretch the legs and arms, lift up the spine, and go to the other side. So I'm just taking you through this little process that I go through whenever I do this posture. A lot of that is automatic. Turning, uprighting, and turning the head. And coming up, and reversing it once more. So we're going back to the right. Slight bend to the knees, outward rotation, uprighting, stretch the legs, stretch the arms, inhale, exhale to the right again. Uprighting and turning the head. Breathe into the low back. Here again, can you release the glute tension, especially on the right side? And coming up and reversing it once more. And last side. And coming up, turn the feet in, step in, and release the arms. As you stand, hips are over the ankles, not pushed forward. So not here, but here. Then using outward rotation to get out of the internal rotation. As the femur sits in a more centrated position in the hip socket, the pelvis will rotate more easily. Then the pelvis can upright. You can use your breath, use your intra-abdominal pressure, use your abdominal muscle, particularly the lower ones, to help stabilize that. Try not to use your glutes and hamstrings. Then uprighting the head with the stable lower back. So just like in 3 months prone and all of those variations we did as preparation for dhanurasana, you want to do all those things when you're standing. And really that 3 months prone position, it is basically the training posture, if you will, for Tadasana. So we'll do a forward bend, and you want a hand support. And I would strongly encourage you to take a little more height than what you normally use, and set that up. And then as you go into the posture, just take your time to go in and make sure that you are stabilizing your low back here as well. So what can often happen, particularly with more flexible people, is as they go forward, they accelerate the pelvis, tipping forward faster than everything else. And so they end up with a lot of hyperextension in the low back, so that even though we want the pelvis to tip forward to do this posture, if it tips forward too fast, to be able to stabilize the low back, I need to tip it back again to release that tension so that I can use my abdominals and my intra-abdominal pressure to support me from the front. Then as I go down, the back won't catch. And that will give me a good idea of what my range is, which can vary from day to day, but also it can vary based on the activity. So in this case, we were doing back bends earlier, and when you do back bends, a lot of times the body needs a little bit of coaxing to get it to bend forward again. So don't force it, but once again, let the body give permission for that bend to happen. Once you can get it out of the back and into the legs and hips, then the legs and hips will start to respond, and then that should take you a little deeper into the posture. And then if you want to decrease the height, you can always do that when that's appropriate. We're not necessarily trying to keep the spine neutral here. It's completely fine and appropriate for the spine to flex. It's just that we want to try to distribute that flexion evenly through the spine and not have it all happen just in one place. So if I have a tendency toward hyperkyphosis, then I'll tend to do all the flexion in my thoracic spine. So it looks like I've gone lower, but all I've really done is just bent from that part of my back. So if I upright the thoracic, upright the head again, then I can redistribute that load. And then of course I want to try to get as much of the bend to happen in my hips and hamstrings as possible. Before you come up, unweight the hands, and that should reactivate the legs, and then the legs should be doing the heavy lifting to lift you up. You want to feel the tailbone releasing down as the spine uprights. Ideally, you end up with that sober feeling in the lower part of the spine, in the lower abdominal area and the pelvis. Good. So we're going to do downward facing dog out of bear, out of squatting. So you're squatting first, then going down into bear. And then you can add a little space between your hands and your feet here. And begin to stretch out the legs, straighten the knees. Here again, make sure that the shoulder girdle is responding to the load. Your weight bearing, you should be actively weight bearing and not just leaning into not just sort of bracing with your shoulder joints. So it helps to think about a lot of the same cues that you would use in a plank, a kneeling plank, or even in 3 months prone. You're stabilizing the low back, anchoring the shoulder blades, lengthening through the crown of the head. You want to keep the ribs connected to the pelvis, shoulder blades connected to the ribs. And gradually stretch the arms. Begins to feel almost like you're stretching your heels down from your hands rather than just from your foot and leg. Chin in, crown of the head lengthening. And then you can bend the knees and come down. And then just briefly into side sitting. And then from side sitting into 3 months supine. can support the head if you need that. And I'd just like you to spend a minute or so here and use this posture as yet another tool at your disposal for opening up and stabilizing your low back. And then slowly lower the feet, try to control that descent. And bring your arms down and rest. And take a block or a half dome, if the block is too high for you, and put that under the pelvis. Make sure you feel the pelvis tipping toward the rib cage. That should create some space in your low back. Give that a little time to fully manifest. And draw the shoulders back. And see if you can push the backs of the shoulders into the floor with minimum disturbance to the low back position, lumbar position. And begin to raise the upper part of the chest. And if you can lift the pelvis a little higher, do that. If that's not a good idea, just keep the lower height. Shoulders back, chest open, ribs dropping, breath in the back, breath down toward the pelvis. And lift your legs up, stretch your legs up into Viparita Karani. And really stretch your legs here. I'm not going to have you hold this for very long, so I want you to really emphasize getting the knees as straight as possible, stretching the legs as much as you can. Good, then bend the knees, bring the feet down. Take the block down if you lifted it before. And then lift your feet again, but this time bring your knees toward your chest. You can put your hands on your knees gently here, add a little bit of load, but at the same time activate the lower abdominals and resist that load. And that combination of trying to flex your hips more but resisting that flexion in your spine should help to open up the lower back yet again. It'll also help to drop the breath down into the pelvic floor. So you might feel that space between your tailbone and your pubic bone, the muscles in that space activating. So that pelvic floor activation is very key for seated forward bends. That's really the way forward for doing seated forward bends in a safe and effective way. So try to maintain that as you release and lower the legs. And then you can take the block out and come down. And roll to the side and sit up. So I'll present two options for a seated forward bend. The easier option would be to sit in dhanurasana, either on a block like so, or using a bolster. You can even put the bolster between your feet and your hips here. Knees are apart, about a little wider than pelvis width, and then going forward this way. And then you can use a block to support the head. So that's the option number one, the easier option. And then the option number two would be Paschimottanasana. You can also add a little height here. Blanket works, half dome works. The feet are a little bit separated, the knees are straight. And then you're going forward here with your knees straight. So you can take your time. If you have extra props you can use to bring the head height up to one that's reachable. Now before you get to your max here, if you're doing Paschimottanasana, then you can grab the outside edges of the mat with your hands and pull as though you're trying to drag the mat forward towards your feet. And as you do that, you're reaching your sit bones and the lower pelvis back away from the feet. And that will start to get deeper into the forward fold and activate the pelvic floor and release the lower back. So when the pelvic floor activates, the lower back releases, and then that frees the spine to bend forward. So that does work rather effectively if you can access it. And then you'll feel like you can go into a deeper forward bend with even less of a feeling of pressure on your back. Then you can reach forward and grab the feet. If your head is supported, either in Paschimottanasana or in the Virasana forward bend, you want that support to feel like it's pulling the skin of the forehead down towards your eyes and not pushing it up toward the crown of your head. So adjust the head position so that you feel that. It should feel like the forehead skin comes down and the eyes can relax. Meanwhile, from the back of the skull, the skin is releasing toward the crown of the head, and the trapezius skin is releasing down the back away from the skull. Eyes, ears, tongue, soft. Good, then come up slowly. And set yourself up in the psoas release, either on a bolster, or if you don't have a bolster, on a half dome and a block. So the bolster set up. All of you have done this many times, but just to review. So, like so, upper back on the bolster. So the bottom edge of the bolster is hitting me about the bottom edge of my shoulder blade. And then my head is on the half dome. If I still feel my chin lifting here, I can add a little more height under my head. I can use a block or add a blanket. So for people who have a lot more hyperkyphosis and who have tight necks, more height can be a good thing. And then the setup with, if you don't have a bolster, assuming you have a half dome and a block, would be the half dome is where your upper back's going to go, and then your block is for your head, either this way or you can put it on its end, or I like to put a blanket on top of the block that way. And now the half dome is, I can feel it just about at the bottom edge of my shoulder blade where the half dome is supporting me here. So either way, make sure you're lying symmetrically. And incidentally, if you find that in either one of these variations you feel like you're really uncomfortable, it's hurting your back, then don't even lie in either one of these. Don't force yourself to do that. In which case I would say then find some support for your head, like a half dome, and then lie with your bolster, if you have one, under your knees, or you can roll up a blanket. So this would be my third choice, but if the first two don't work for you, this would be what I would recommend for relaxation. Adjust the shoulder blades down and apart. Again, make sure you're symmetrical. And when you're ready, you can close your eyes. and begin to go inside.